No generation has spoken about exhaustion with such clinical clarity, and yet grasped it so poorly. We catalog its symptoms. We chart stress responses. We adjust sleep, diet, and stimulation. Still, exhaustion remains. Not as a passing bodily state, but as a settled condition of the interior life. This is because exhaustion is not first something the body undergoes. It is a disorder in the soul's orientation toward its end. 8 centuries ago, St. Thomas Aquinas addressed this weariness without recourse to physiology, because he understood a principle now largely forgotten. A power is fatigued not because it acts, but because it acts without attaining its end. 1. Rest and final causality. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, rest belongs properly to the appetite. Rest is the repose of a power in the attainment of its proper object. The will, whose object is the good, rests only when it attains the good for which it was made. Man, Aquinas teaches, is ordered to God as his final end. Not as one good among others, nor as a partial perfection, but as the universal good in whom the will finds complete satisfaction. Therefore, whenever the will is not ordered to God, it remains in motion. This motion is not neutral. It is the consequence of an appetite seeking repose where repose cannot be found. Motion without repose produces fatigue. This fatigue is not first corporeal. It is spiritual. It is the weariness of a will deprived of its proper term. 2. The error of reduction. Modern accounts of exhaustion tend to reduce it to quantity of activity or intensity of stimulation. Such accounts are not false, but they are incomplete. Bodily mechanisms can explain how exhaustion manifests. They cannot explain why it persists even when conditions improve. For Aquinas, a disorder exceeding the proportion of the body must be referred to a higher principle. Exhaustion that remains after bodily causes are addressed indicates a disorder of final causality. The soul is not resting because it is not ordered. 3. Silence as condition. Silence is avoided by the modern soul not because silence is empty, but because silence removes accidental goods and places the soul before its final cause. Silence removes nothing essential. It removes only what is extrinsic to rest. When exterior stimulation ceases, the soul becomes aware of its own disordered motion. This awareness is painful not because it is false, but because it reveals the absence of repose. Aquinas does not interpret this reaction psychologically. He interprets it teleologically. Every power of the soul is specified by its object. The intellect is ordered to truth. The will is ordered to the good. And because the will is ordered to the universal good, no particular good can satisfy it completely. Whenever the will seeks repose in created goods, it experiences division. Unity follows order to the end. Dispersion follows the loss of that order. Silence reveals dispersion because silence removes distraction and restores awareness of final causality. 4. Acidia, the formal cause of exhaustion. This resistance to silence is not mere weakness. It is not distraction. It is not pathology. It has a determinate name: Acidia. Aquinas defines Acidia as sorrow at the divine good, insofar as the divine good draws the soul upward. It is not sorrow at pain. It is not sorrow at suffering. It is sorrow at the arduousness of the spiritual good. The divine good exceeds the soul's inclination toward ease. Thus, the will recoils, not by hatred, but by aversion. Acidia weighs upon the will and renders spiritual acts burdensome. Hence, prayer appears difficult. Contemplation is resisted. Interior stillness is avoided. Acidia does not arise because God is evil, but because the soul resists being perfected. Since charity unites the will to God, and Acidia sorrows at that union, Acidia stands directly opposed to charity. Therefore, Acidia is not fatigue. It is a defect of love. 5. Effusio ad exteriora. Every sorrow, Aquinas teaches, seeks relief through motion. But the soul cannot flee God by distance, for God is not spatial. Therefore, the soul flees by dispersion. Aquinas names this effect effusio ad exteriora, the pouring out of the soul into exterior things. From Acidia proceeds a heaviness of the mind by which the soul turns away from spiritual goods and seeks consolation in sensible and external objects. This movement is causal, not metaphorical. The soul disperses itself into multiplicity, sound, activity, novelty, exterior motion. Exterior movement replaces interior repose. Thus, noise becomes refuge, and activity becomes a substitute for rest. Silence becomes threatening because it removes the means of dispersion. 4th, the daughters of Acidia. St. Gregory the Great enumerates the daughters of Acidia, which Aquinas receives and confirms. Among them, instability of place, not merely physical movement, but the inability of the soul to remain recollected. Curiositas, an inordinate desire for knowledge sought without order, not for wisdom, but for stimulation. Loquacity, disordered speech arising from interior unrest. These are not independent vices, but manifestations of a single disorder, aversion to the divine good. 5. The disorder of the sensitive appetite. This disorder is intensified when the sensitive appetite is not governed by reason. As Garrigou-Lagrange explains, the unpurified soul lives chiefly through the senses. Sensible pleasure becomes the primary mode of reassurance. When sensible goods are withdrawn, the sensitive appetite resists. The soul then confuses the loss of pleasure with the loss of being. Thus, silence appears destructive, not because being is threatened, but because disordered attachment is exposed. 6. Curiosity and the intellect. The intellect likewise suffers disorder. Aquinas distinguishes studiousness from curiosity. Studiousness orders the intellect to truth for the sake of wisdom. Curiosity seeks knowledge without order or measure. Curiosity is not condemned because it seeks knowledge, but because it seeks knowledge apart from finality. Thus, the curious intellect seeks stimulation, not repose. Silence interrupts this disorder by removing novelty and exposing the lack of intellectual rest. 7th, grace and the restoration of order. Human discipline can restrain exterior acts. It cannot heal the will. Aquinas teaches that wounds exceeding nature require grace for their healing. Grace heals the will by restoring its orientation to God. Grace elevates the will by enabling it to attain its supernatural end. Therefore, silence alone does not restore order. Silence prepares the soul for grace. Active recollection disposes the powers. Grace accomplishes their union. Without grace, silence becomes unbearable. With grace, silence becomes habitation. 8. Peace as the tranquility of order. Peace, Aquinas teaches, is not an emotion. Peace is the tranquility of order. Peace arises when the powers of the soul are unified under their proper hierarchy. When the senses obey reason, reason is illumined by faith, and the will rests in God, the soul ceases to flee. Silence no longer terrifies, it confirms order. Conclusion. The modern mind is exhausted not because it labors too much, but because it is divided. It seeks rest where rest cannot be found. Silence removes substitutes. Grace restores orientation. Order produces peace. Rest is not achieved by escape. Rest is achieved by return. When the soul returns to its final end, it rests.